The body in Bay 6 had been there for 11 days, which was 9 days longer than it should have been. I found it during a routine inventory check, a Wednesday afternoon in early March, the kind of gray Ohio day that made the fluorescent lights in the morgue feel like they were the only source of illumination left on Earth. I was behind on everything. The audit from the State Division of Professional Licensing was 6 weeks out, and our case backlog had swollen to a size that made my stomach tight every time I opened the management software. His name was Gerald Kimball, age 71, found unresponsive in his home by a neighbor who hadn't seen him collect his mail in 4 days. Unattended death, no suspicious circumstances, but the county protocol required a preliminary examination and my sign-off before the body could be released to the funeral home. Standard work, 40 minutes, maybe an hour if the paperwork fought me. The problem was that the paperwork had already been done. I was sitting at the med-exam terminal, entering Kimball's case number to begin the intake documentation, and the system pulled up a completed file. Preliminary examination, external findings, manner of death recommendation, next of kin notification status, all filled in, all time-stamped, all carrying my digital signature. I stared at the screen for a long time. The timestamp read March 2nd, 11:47 p.m. On March 2nd, at 11:47 p.m., I had been at home watching a documentary about the Dust Bowl and finishing the last third of a bottle of Malbec. I remembered it specifically because I'd spilled wine on the couch cushion and spent 20 minutes blotting it with dish soap, which had only made it worse. I checked the signature authentication. It was valid. MedExam uses a 2-factor system, employee login plus a 6-digit PIN that changes monthly. Both had been entered correctly. I read through the case notes. They were thorough, clinically precise. They used abbreviations I used. LAD for left anterior descending, NR for non-remarkable, PEX for preliminary examination. The formatting matched my habits. Findings listed in anatomical order, starting cranial and working down, with a separate paragraph for lividity and decomposition markers. The findings themselves appeared accurate. I hadn't examined Kimball yet, but the external observations in the file were consistent with a 71-year-old man dead for 4 to 6 days in a heated home. Skin slippage on the hands, marbling across the abdomen, purge fluid, everything you'd expect. I logged out of the terminal and sat in my chair and tried to construct a reasonable explanation. System error, a records migration artifact. We'd updated MedExam in January, and the transition had produced a few duplicate entries and timestamp errors. Patty had spent a week sorting them out. Maybe this was a leftover, some fragment of an old case grafted onto Kimball's file through a database collision. But database collisions don't generate original clinical observations. They duplicate existing data. The notes in Kimball's file described his body, his specific condition, his specific findings. I told myself I'd mention it to Patty in the morning and pulled up a blank template to begin my own examination. When I opened Bay 6 and looked at Gerald Kimball, the external findings matched the phantom file exactly. I mentioned it to Patty the next day. She listened with the patient, mildly impatient expression she used for problems she considered to be technology's fault rather than hers. The January migration threw everything off, she said. I'm still finding misfiled attachments in the quarterly reports. You want me to flag it for the software vendor? The notes aren't duplicated from another case, I said. They describe Kimball specifically. Then you probably started the file and forgot to save it. Came back and finished it later. She glanced at me over her glasses. You've been working a lot of late nights. I had been working a lot of late nights. This was true. The backlog was my responsibility because I was the only board-certified deputy in the office. Dr. Renner hadn't performed an autopsy in 3 years. He attended county commission meetings, signed off on my reports, and went home by 4 o'clock. The actual work, the bodies, the documentation, the testimony, was mine. I wasn't here on March 2nd, I said. Okay, Patty typed something. I'll put in a ticket. I let it go. I had 7 cases waiting and a deposition to prepare for. And the Kimball anomaly was exactly the kind of distraction I couldn't afford 6 weeks before a state audit. It took 4 days for me to find the next one. The case was a 23-year-old woman named Dana Torrance, pulled from a drainage culvert along the old Norfolk Southern Rail corridor south of town. Manner of death was still pending when I'd left the office at 6 p.m. on Friday, March 4th. I'd planned to begin her examination Monday morning. Monday morning, the examination was already documented. MedExam showed a completed preliminary file, signed with my credentials, time-stamped Saturday, March 5th at 2:14 a.m. The PIN authentication was valid. The clinical notes were detailed, methodical, and written in my professional voice. External examination, injury cataloging, sample collection, all logged. I checked the keycard system. The door to the morgue, a heavy steel fire door that required a county-issued proximity card, had been opened at 1:58 a.m. on March 5th. The access log recorded employee ID 1104, my ID, at 1:58 a.m. on March 5th. I had been asleep in my rented house in Dunkirk, 12 miles away. My phone's location history confirmed it. My car's odometer hadn't changed. I'd noted the mileage Friday evening because I needed to submit a reimbursement form. I went down to the morgue and opened the bay where Dana Torrance was stored. The external findings described in the phantom file were accurate, not approximately accurate, precisely accurate. The file noted a small tattoo on the inside of her left wrist, a crescent moon, partially obscured by an abrasion. I checked. The tattoo was there. The abrasion was there. Whoever, whatever, had documented this case had been in the room with the body and had examined it with professional competence. I called Patty and asked for the complete keycard log for the past 30 days. She told me she'd have it by the end of the week. I said I needed it today. She said she'd see what she could do. Then I sat in my office and looked at the two phantom files side by side on my screen. The clinical language was indistinguishable from my own, not similar, identical. The same comma placement before subordinate clauses in the findings narrative, the same way I parenthetically note measurement tolerances, the same habit of writing consistent with instead of indicative of, which my residency supervisor at Ohio State had drilled into me 15 years ago. This was not a system error. Someone had access to my credentials, my knowledge, and my professional habits, and they were using them to do my job in the middle of the night. I thought about calling Marcus Tierney at the sheriff's office. Then I thought about what I would actually say. Detective, someone broke into the morgue and performed autopsies using my login. He would ask if anything was stolen. He would ask if the work was wrong. He would ask if anyone was harmed. Nothing was stolen. The work wasn't wrong. In a strict sense, no one was harmed. I didn't call Marcus. The keycard log arrived Thursday. I printed it out and spread the pages across my desk and felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, but the beginning of a permanent uneasiness that wouldn't fully leave me for months. Over the previous 30 days, my keycard had recorded 14 nighttime entries to the morgue. The earliest was February 9th at 1:42 a.m. The most recent was the Dana Torrance entry on March 5th. I cross-referenced each entry against my personal records, phone location, car mileage logs, credit card statements, anything that could place me. For 11 of the 14 entries, I could confirm I was at home. For 2, I couldn't be certain. They fell on nights when I had worked late and my records were ambiguous. One entry, on February 18th, fell on a night when I had been in Columbus visiting my sister, 100 miles away. I had the hotel receipt. Each nighttime entry corresponded to a case file in MedExam. I checked them one by one. All were fully documented. All carried my digital signature and valid PIN authentication. All contained accurate clinical observations, and all 14 cases shared one geographic detail. Every body had been recovered from, or within 500 feet of, the old Norfolk Southern rail corridor south of Kenton. I pulled up a county map on my computer and marked the recovery locations. The rail corridor ran roughly north-south through the rural stretch between Kenton and Ridgeway, about 11 miles of abandoned track bed, partially overgrown, crossed by a handful of county roads. The locations weren't clustered. They were spread along the full length of the corridor. The deaths spanned different causes: exposure, accidental fall, cardiac event, overdose, vehicle accident on a crossing road, different ages, different demographics. The only common thread was the geography. I stood up from my desk and walked down the hallway to the drinking fountain. I held my hand under the cold water and watched it run over my fingers and tried to think clearly. 14 cases, all phantom documented under my credentials, all clinically sound, all originating from the same 11-mile stretch of abandoned railroad. I had performed my own examinations on several of these bodies already, during normal working hours, not knowing the phantom documentation existed. In every instance, my findings matched the phantom files. In 3 cases, the phantom files had noted details I'd initially missed: a hairline fracture of the hyoid bone, an atypical lividity pattern, a trace of calciumite powder in the clothing that I'd only found after targeted inspection. The phantom examiner wasn't just competent. In some respects, the phantom examiner was better than I was. I went to find Glenn Harker, the night security guard. Glenn worked the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, covering the county services building and the adjacent records annex. He was a quiet, slightly built man who studied for an electrician's certification during the slow hours and kept a meticulous daily log in a composition notebook, not because it was required, but because it was his nature. March 5th, I said, Saturday night, early Sunday morning. Did you see anyone enter the building? He checked his notebook. Nobody signed in. I did a walkthrough at midnight and another at 3. Building was empty. The keycard log shows the morgue door opening at 1:58 a.m. Glenn frowned. I was at the front desk at 1:58. Nobody came through the lobby. Is there another way into the basement? The loading dock has a roll-up door, but it doesn't have keycard access. It's padlocked from the inside. He paused. I can check the hallway camera. The county had 1 security camera that covered the basement, a single unit mounted above the elevator at the end of the corridor, aimed down the hall toward the morgue entrance. Budget constraints had prevented the installation of cameras inside the morgue itself. This was a point Renner brought up at every budget hearing and that the county commission declined to fund every year. Glenn pulled the footage for March 5th. We watched it together on his small monitor in the security office. At 1:58:03 a.m., the morgue door opened. The hallway was empty. No one was visible. The door swung inward about 18 inches, paused for approximately 4 seconds, and closed. The electromagnetic lock re-engaged. At 3:22:09 a.m., the door opened again. Same behavior. Swung inward, paused, closed. The keycard log registered both events as entries and exits by employee ID 1104. Glenn looked at me. Magnetic latch malfunction? Magnetic latch malfunctions don't enter a PIN in the case management software. He didn't have a response to that. I found the note on a Tuesday. It was tucked inside the physical case binder for a February entry. Harold Voss, age 58, found deceased in his truck at a rail crossing on Township Road 90. I was reviewing the physical backups as part of my audit preparation, matching paper records against the digital files, when a loose sheet of notepaper slipped out of the binder and landed on the floor. It was a handwritten observation note, the kind I sometimes jotted during an examination when the computer terminal was across the room and I didn't want to lose a detail. I kept a stack of county-issued notepads on the counter next to the instrument tray for exactly this purpose. The note read, PEX, Voss, H. Bilateral periorbital ecchymosis, not consistent W stated position at recovery. Suggest cranial imaging prior to final determination. See mandibular asymmetry, R side. It was my handwriting. My characteristic lowercase g, which loops backward instead of forward, because I broke 3 fingers on my left hand when I was 9 and taught myself a modified grip during occupational therapy. My preferred abbreviation style. My habit of underlining clinical terms once rather than bolding them. Harold Voss was a phantom case. Documented on February 22nd at 2:14 a.m. under my credentials. I had never examined Harold Voss. I had never written this note, but it was, by every measure I could apply, my handwriting. I put the note in a clear document sleeve and locked it in my desk drawer. My hands were steady, but I noticed I was breathing through my mouth, the way I do when I'm concentrating on a body and the smell is bad. That evening I sat in my rented house in Dunkirk and drank 2 glasses of wine and considered the possibilities. 1. I was losing time. Sleepwalking, dissociative episodes, alcohol blackouts, driving 12 miles to the office, performing forensic examinations, and returning home with no memory. This was the explanation that frightened me most, because it had a family precedent. My mother had started losing time at 42. Within 5 years, she couldn't remember my name. 2. Someone had duplicated my credentials and was deliberately impersonating me in the morgue. A sophisticated targeted identity theft involving cloned keycards, stolen pins, forged handwriting, and medical knowledge equivalent to a board-certified forensic pathologist, for no apparent reason, with no financial motive, producing work that was accurate and helpful. 3. Something I did not have a category for. I picked up the phone and called Marcus Tierney. "I need to talk to you about something at the office," I said. "Off the record, if that's possible." "Buy me breakfast," he said. "Waffle House on 68, 7 o'clock. I told Marcus everything over scattered hash browns and weak coffee. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always appreciated about him. When I finished, he stirred his coffee and looked out the window at the parking lot for a while. "You said the phantom files are accurate, clinically accurate. In some cases, more thorough than my own initial work. And nothing's missing from the morgue? No evidence tampering? No body misidentification? Nothing. Everything checks out. The work is good. Then I have to ask you something, and I want you to hear it as a professional question, not a personal one. Go ahead. Is there any chance you're doing this yourself and not remembering?" I had prepared for this. "I've thought about that. I can account for my location on 11 of the 14 nights. One night I was in Columbus at a hotel. I have the receipt. What about the other 2? Ambiguous. I was working late. My records aren't clear enough to prove I went home. Have you talked to anyone? A doctor? No. Would you be willing to? Marcus, if I go to a doctor and say I might be experiencing blackouts, I lose my certification. I can't perform examinations, I can't sign death certificates, and the 6-week audit turns into a catastrophe that affects every pending case in the county. Families waiting for closure." He nodded slowly. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know if anyone else has reported anything unusual along the Norfolk Southern corridor." All 14 cases were recovered from that stretch. Something changed in his face. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, the kind of expression a detective makes when a question connects to something he's been carrying around but hasn't spoken about. "That's a lot of bodies for 11 miles of abandoned rail." "I know. I'll pull the recovery data going back 5 years, see if the numbers are normal." He took a sip of coffee. "In the meantime, change your PIN. If someone cloned your credentials, a new PIN should stop them." I changed my PIN that afternoon. The new one was random. I used an online generator and memorized it without writing it down. 3 nights later, a new phantom file appeared in MedExam. Signed with my credentials. New PIN authenticated. I hadn't told anyone the new PIN. I hadn't written it down. It existed only in my memory. Dr. Renner called me into his office on Friday. He was sitting behind his desk with his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, and his expression arranged into what he probably thought was compassionate concern, but looked more like a man rehearsing for a difficult conversation. "Nora, Patty tells me there are some irregularities in the case management system." "There are. She also tells me you've been asking for security footage and keycard logs." "I have. I want to make sure this gets handled appropriately before the audit." He folded his hands. "Is this a technical issue, or is this something else?" "I'm not sure yet, because if there's a security concern, we should involve the county IT department. And if it's a personal concern," he paused delicately, "I know the separation has been difficult. If you need time, I can bring in Dr. Mishra from Allen County on a temporary basis." "I don't need time. I need to understand why the system is logging me into the building on nights when I'm not here." "That does sound like a technical issue. It's not just the access logs. Case files are being completed. Examinations are being documented, under my signature. Is the documentation inaccurate? No." He spread his hands slightly, as if I'd just made his point for him. "Then let's let IT take a look at it, get the records cleaned up before the auditors arrive, and not create a larger problem than we have." "A larger problem, Nora." His tone shifted, still gentle, but with the firm undertone of a man who'd survived 4 re-election campaigns. "If we report a security breach in the case management system 6 weeks before a state audit, every death certificate this office has signed in the past year becomes contestable. That's families. That's court cases. That's liability the county can't absorb. You understand that?" I understood it. "Let IT run a diagnostic. Let me talk to the commission about accelerating the camera installation for the morgue interior. and let's get through the audit." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just resolved a problem. I did not let it go. I spent the next 2 weeks building a private file. I documented every phantom entry, printed every keycard log, screenshotted every case file timestamp, photographed the handwritten note with a ruler for scale. I kept the file at home, in a lockbox under my bed, because I no longer entirely trusted the office. I also pulled the recovery data that Marcus had offered to check. He'd gotten busy with a domestic case in Ada and hadn't followed up, so I submitted the public records requests myself. 5 years of incident reports involving the Norfolk Southern Corridor in Hardin County. The numbers weren't normal. Over the past 5 years, 29 bodies had been recovered from the rail corridor or its immediate vicinity. The state average for a comparable stretch of abandoned rail in a rural county was 4 to 7. 29 was not a statistical anomaly. It was a pattern. I plotted them on the map. The distribution was irregular. Some clusters near road crossings, a few in the overgrown stretches between, several at a partially collapsed trestle bridge over a creek near the midpoint of the corridor. The causes of death varied widely. No obvious serial pattern, no consistent demographic, just an 11-mile stretch of abandoned railroad that collected the dead at 4 to 5 times the expected rate, and something in the county morgue that processed them under my name while I slept. I drove the corridor on a Saturday afternoon. It was early April, still cold, the trees leafless and the fields on either side brown and flat. The rail bed itself was overgrown with scrub brush and young trees. The rails pulled up decades ago when Norfolk Southern abandoned the line. A gravel maintenance road paralleled parts of it, but long stretches were accessible only on foot. It was unremarkable. That was the unsettling thing. No atmosphere of dread, no unusual features, no feeling of being watched. Just a forgotten strip of infrastructure slowly returning to the landscape. I walked about 2 miles of it, from Township Road 90 south to the Trestle Bridge, and the only notable thing I found was a surveyor's marker from 1987 and a rusted section of rail that had been left behind. At the Trestle Bridge, I stopped and looked at the creek below. It was shallow, maybe 18 inches of brown water over a gravel bottom. A shopping cart was visible downstream, half buried in silt. The bridge itself was concrete and steel, structurally compromised on the north end where a support had cracked, but still standing. I checked my map. 4 bodies had been recovered within 200 feet of this bridge. 2 from the creek, 1 from the rail bed, 1 from the maintenance road. I stood there for a while. The wind came across the field and pushed at my jacket. I looked at the bridge and the creek and the flat, empty land on either side and tried to feel something. Anything that would explain why this place collected the dead. I felt nothing except cold. I drove home. That night, another phantom file appeared. The body was a 44-year-old man named Dennis Kiefer, found by a jogger on the maintenance road a quarter-mile south of the Trestle Bridge. The phantom file documented the preliminary examination with its usual precision. Cause of death, hypothermia, complicated by acute alcohol intoxication. Manner, accident. The file included a note I recognized as my own clinical style. Abrasion pattern on palms and anterior knees, consistent with forward collapse onto gravel surface. No defensive injuries. No evidence of third-party involvement. Position and clothing consistent with ambulatory exposure. I went to the morgue the next morning and examined Dennis Kiefer myself. Every observation in the phantom file was correct. The abrasions were exactly as described. The lividity was consistent with the body's recovery position. The blood alcohol level, when the toxicology came back 2 weeks later, matched the phantom file's preliminary estimate within 1/10 of a point. Whatever was using my credentials wasn't guessing. It was performing forensic pathology. I set up the vigil for a Friday night. Marcus had come through with the corridor data by then and had arrived at the same conclusion I had about the numbers. He'd also run a quiet background check on everyone with building access. Glenn, Patty, the 2 custodial staff, the IT contractor who'd handled the med exam migration, and found nothing. No one had the combination of access, motive, and expertise. The only person who could do what the phantom files demonstrated was me. So we watch, Marcus said. You stay inside. I stay in the parking lot. You set up your phone to record. If someone comes in, I see them. If nobody comes in and the system still logs activity, then we know it's not a person. And then what? Then we figure out what it is. I arrived at the morgue at 9 p.m. and locked the door from the inside. My phone was propped on the counter, recording video with the screen dimmed to save battery. The med-exam terminal was logged out, the screen dark. The keycard reader on the inside of the door showed a steady green light. Locked, secure. I sat in the rolling chair at my desk and waited. The morgue was quiet in a way that offices aren't during the day. The refrigeration units hummed. A pipe somewhere in the ceiling ticked as it expanded or contracted. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of consciousness. I'd spent hundreds of hours in this room, often alone, often late. It had never bothered me. It bothered me that night. At 11:45 p.m., I texted Marcus. Nothing yet. System quiet. He replied, no one in or out. Parking lot empty except us. At 1:30 a.m., I was fighting to stay awake. The wine I'd abstained from that evening would have been welcome. I stood up and paced. I checked the bays. 4 occupied. Bay 4 held the most recent intake. A 67-year-old woman named Ruth Aspinall, found deceased in a parked car at the rail crossing on County Road 150. I had scheduled her examination for Monday. At 2:11 a.m., the keycard reader on the door beeped. The green light turned red, then green again. The log would show, I knew, that employee ID 1104 had just entered the room. The door did not open. I was standing 6 feet from it. No one touched it. I looked at the med-exam terminal across the room. The screen was still dark. At 2:14 a.m., the screen lit up. The login sequence played out in front of me. The employee ID field populated, the password field filled with masked characters. The PIN prompt appeared and was answered. The system opened to the case management dashboard. A new case file opened. Aspinall, Ruth A. I walked slowly across the room toward the terminal. The cursor was moving. Text appeared in the preliminary examination field, character by character, at approximately the speed I typed. External examination, Caucasian female, appears consistent with stated age of 67 years. Body received clothed in dark blue polyester slacks, cream-colored blouse, gray wool cardigan. Lividity fixed, posterior, consistent with supine position. Rigor resolved. I looked at Bay 4. Ruth Aspinall was inside, exactly as described. The cursor continued. No visible external trauma. Skin turgor decreased. Mild bilateral pedal edema. Fingernails. Mild cyanosis. Facial expression, neutral. Oral cavity. Upper denture in place. Partial lower denture displaced rightward. I checked Bay 4 again. The displaced lower denture was correct. I hadn't opened this bay since intake. Whoever, whatever, was generating these notes had observed the body. The text kept appearing. It was my language, my sentence structures, my clinical judgment. I watched the screen document an examination I was not performing, in my name, with my credentials, in a room where I was the only living person. I reached behind the terminal and pulled the Ethernet cable from the wall port. The screen went dark. The login session terminated. I stood in the buzzing silence and looked at the blank screen for a long time. The refrigeration units hummed. The pipe ticked. At 2:22 a.m., the keycard reader beeped again. Green to red to green. The log would record that employee ID 1104 had exited the room. I was still standing next to the terminal. I had not touched the keycard reader. My proximity card was in my jacket pocket, hanging on a hook by the door, 8 feet away. I texted Marcus, "Come inside." He came in through the lobby and down the elevator, and I showed him the keycard log on the reader's local display. Entry at 2:11 a.m., exit at 2:22 a.m. Employee ID 1104. While I was in the room, the terminal activated. I said, it started typing. Case notes for the body in Bay 4. Accurate notes. In my clinical style. Marcus looked at the terminal, at the disconnected Ethernet cable, at the keycard reader, at me. He was not a man who spooked easily. He'd worked 20 years in rural law enforcement and had seen most of what people could do to each other. But he stood in that morgue and I watched him arrive at the edge of what his experience could process. "I don't have a category for this," he said. "Neither do I." We stood there for a moment. The refrigeration units hummed. "The phantom files?" I said. All the corridor cases, whatever this is, it's documenting them, processing them, using my credentials to make the paperwork official. Death certificates, manner of death determinations. These are legal documents. They have standing. Why your credentials? Because I'm the only one who does the work. Renner hasn't touched a body in 3 years. My credentials are the ones with authority. What does it get out of it? I didn't have an answer, but I had been thinking about it. And the only framework that made any sense was one I didn't want to say out loud in the morgue at 2:30 in the morning. So I said it in the parking lot standing next to Marcus's truck in the cold air. 29 bodies from that corridor in 5 years, 4 to 5 times the expected rate, and something making sure every one of them gets properly documented, properly identified, and properly released to their families. You think it's connected to the deaths? I think it cares about the paperwork. Marcus leaned against his truck. That's a hell of a thing to care about. It's the only thing in the process that gives the dead a name, a cause, a record that they existed and how they stopped existing. Without the documentation, they're just bodies. We didn't talk about it again that night. He followed me home to make sure I got there, and I sat in my kitchen until dawn, not drinking, not sleeping, just thinking about a stretch of abandoned railroad that collected the dead and something that gave them the dignity of being officially known. I met with Dr. Renner the following Monday and told him I was requesting a transfer. He was relieved. I could see it in the way his shoulders dropped. A quarter inch, maybe less. But I'd spent 8 years reading his body language in staff meetings, and I knew what relief looked like on Lyle Renner. I think that's probably wise, he said. You've been carrying too much here, and you deserve a larger office with better support. I want to be clear about why I'm leaving. Nora, the system anomalies are real. The phantom entries are real. I've documented everything. I'm leaving a copy with you and a copy with my attorney. I understand. Do you? He gave me the look he reserved for moments when he wanted a conversation to end without confrontation. I've already spoken with County IT. They're attributing the keycard irregularities to a firmware issue with the proximity reader. The med exam entries are being reclassified as migration artifacts. The audit won't be affected. And the handwritten note? What handwritten note? I looked at him for a long time. He held my gaze with the steady, slightly sorrowful expression of a man who had decided what the truth was and was not interested in alternatives. I'll process my cases through the end of the month, I said. Dr. Mishra can cover until you hire someone. I appreciate your professionalism, Nora. I always have. I finished my cases. I boxed my personal items. I updated the case files and left the physical binders in good order and made sure the med exam records were clean. My real records, the ones I had generated during normal working hours. The phantom files had been reclassified by IT into an archive folder labeled Migration Errors, Do Not Audit. On my last day, I handed my keycard to Patty. She took it without ceremony and dropped it in a desk drawer. Dr. Mishra will need a new card issued, I said. I'll put in the request. I drove away from the Hardin County Services Building on April 28th and started at the Franklin County Coroner's office in Columbus the following week. It was a larger operation. 4 deputies, a fully staffed forensic lab, modern facilities, no backlog, no solo shifts, cameras in every room. I slept better. I stopped checking the clock at 2:14 a.m. The audit in Hardin County came and went in June. They passed with no findings. I heard about it from Marcus, who called to tell me and to say that the body count on the Norfolk Southern Corridor had continued. 2 more since I'd left, both properly documented. He didn't say by whom. Mishra's been handling everything, he said, or at least she thinks she has. I didn't ask him to elaborate. The public records request I'd filed in March for all keycard entries associated with employee ID 1104 was fulfilled by the county in July. Government timelines. The response arrived in a manila envelope at my apartment in Columbus, printed on county letterhead with a cover sheet noting that the records were provided pursuant to Ohio Revised Code Section 149.43. I opened it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and no wine. The log was comprehensive. Every entry and exit recorded under my ID from September 2021 through the date of the request. I flipped to the end, to the entries after April 28th, my last day of employment. There were 3. May 14th, 2:14 a.m., entry and exit. June 3rd, 2:14 a.m., entry and exit. June 19th, 2:14 a.m., entry and exit. My keycard was in Patty's desk drawer in Kenton. My med-exam credentials had been deactivated on April 29th. Employee ID 1104 had been formally retired in the system. I set the paper down on the table. The corridor was still collecting its dead, and something was still making sure they were properly received. I drank my coffee. I did not call anyone. There was nothing, in any professional system I had access to, that could account for what was on that page. I filed the document in the lockbox under my bed and went to work. 3 weeks later, I requested the Hardin County Coroner's public case log for May and June. Routine, publicly available data, just the case numbers, dates, and recovery locations. No names, no medical information. Every case number that appeared on a date matching the phantom keycard entries originated from the Norfolk Southern Rail Corridor. The documentation was complete. The signatures were valid. The dead had been given names, causes, and records. Employee ID 1104 had been retired. But the work continued. It was a Thursday when I noticed the last thing. I was reviewing the case log one more time, checking dates, when I saw that each phantom entry, every single one across the entire 7 months I had tracked, occurred at the same time, 2:14 a.m. I opened my own personnel file, the one I'd saved digitally before leaving the county. Hired September 4th, 2014, 2:14. I closed the file and put everything away and did not look at it again.